So hello, everyone. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. Today, we'll be speaking with Jane Hirshfield, the prize-winning poet, essayist, and translator. One of today's best-known poets, Jane was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. She has won more literary awards than I can list here, and I'm happy to say that she is a longtime Tricycle contributing editor. Her most recent collection of poetry is The Asking, New and Selected Poems. We'll put a link to the book in the chat, and of course, I highly recommend that you get yourself a copy. We're also going to put Jane's schedule, her Facebook schedule from her Facebook page in the chat, so you'll be able to link to that too. We'll be putting it in again for those of you who join us later. This interview will be recorded and made available to all of you who have registered and to those who are not able to make it to the live event. You'll receive an email link to the recording. You can also listen to a recent episode of Tricycle Talks with Jane at tricycle.org/podcast. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. After I speak with Jane, she'll read a few poems and you'll have an opportunity to ask her questions. You can post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen as you're listening to our exchange. So Jane, if you'd like to come on, I can welcome you. Hi, Jane. Great to see you.
I'm happy to be here with everybody. It looks like a really wide-ranging group of people. Thank you all for coming from whatever time zone.
And they're from all sorts of time zones. But Jane, before we start, I just have to tell you something funny. Our publisher, Sam Mao's sister, is getting married this weekend, and guess what poem they'll be reading as part of the ceremony?
Oh, that's just fabulous. So for people who don't know what we're talking about, it's a poem called A Blessing for Wedding. And it's in the new book. It's in the book that came out when it was, when it was new. But it was first published on Tricycle's inside back cover. And people started having weddings left and right with it from that moment on.
And the next generation seems to be using it too, so that's great. Jane, I'd like to start with a topic that some may consider counterintuitive. You think it is not? If you don't mind, I'd like you to read a poem of yours called Optimism.
So I will preface this only by saying that I wrote this poem at a time when I needed some optimism, not because I was already inhabiting it, for both personal reasons and because of things that were going on in the broader world. So, optimism. More and more I have come to admire resilience, not the simple resistance of a pillow, whose foam returns over and over to the same shape, but the sinuous tenacity of a tree. Finding the light newly blocked on one side, it turns in another. A blind intelligence, true, but out of such persistence arose turtles, rivers, mitochondria, figs. All this resinous, unretractable earth.
Thank you, Jane. That was beautiful. So first, I'd just like to ask something that may sound a bit silly, but at a time like this, what does optimism mean to you?
Well, at a time like this, optimism means to me primarily, how do we counter despair? Because the news of the world is so difficult in so many different dimensions. In one way, I feel, as a practicing Buddhist, we know suffering is ubiquitous, continuous, the first noble truth. And yet, it does seem as though the suffering and the causes of suffering are more visible to us because we hear about them more, but also perhaps more extremely consequential for our fellow beings because of how much the crisis of the biosphere is now added on top of the crises of all our longer running human delusions. And they're not at all disconnected, they're quite continuous. But I have to very often find a way to reply to despair or fear or worry or anxiety. And optimism is one of the technologies of being able to go on, being able to open your eyes in the morning and take the next breath. And not only that, but embrace this world, embrace it, treasure it, feel grateful for it, all of that.
Well, you know, in the poem, you make a real distinction between resilience and resistance. And, you know, sometimes we angrily talk about resistance. Can you talk a little bit about that distinction?
I can. And, you know, if I go back to what was in my mind when I wrote the poem, it was simply to say that resilience is so much more than an automatic, repeated, blind optimism, one might call it, or, you know, just a denial of what one is feeling and a leap into something else. So that resistance of a pillow, there's no intelligence in it. Whereas the optimism in this poem, it is primarily speaking from the point of view of biological resilience and the way that evolution itself is on the side of life, is on the side of continuance, maybe not any individual being's continuance, but it is definitely on the side of life, change as something to embrace rather than to find only sad. So, you know, that the simple matter of the trees, you know, so when I found out about what is technically or perhaps colloquially in the tree world called crown shyness, it means that a tree will not grow into another tree's light. They don't fight for dominance if they have another way to find light. They will move away from the other tree. And they can tell that before they land in shadow because the wavelengths of the light, the greenness of the light grows more. And so they will literally collaborate, form a forest alliance. And, you know I'm talking in the language of making sound human what isn't human. But I think everyone listening must know that the scientific research is certainly catching up to the fact that there is an intelligence even in plants. Although it is not the same as our intelligence, it is certainly their altruism, their skillful means. The skillful means of a forest is pronounced and at this point recognizable. You can follow the sugars as they're being transmitted from the mother tree to the young tree that needs a little more sustenance.
So you refer to a blind intelligence. So in other words, that's a reference to a very different kind of intelligence.
Yes. Yes. Well, the blind intelligence, that's different from the blind optimism I was just talking about. The blind intelligence, true, in that line, what it's saying is, you know, evolution is not teleological. It is not governed by a divine hand. It just carries forth. So in that case, it's closer to the blind intelligence of the Rinzai praise of one's teacher as a blind donkey, or one's friend is a blind donkey. That's that kind of blind. Words just shape shift. Every time you use them, they mean something different. And yet our wonderful human intelligence is such that we actually understand one another most of the time.
Okay, so you've been called a spokesperson for the biosphere. You write of your deep love of the earth and also your grief at its destruction. So how to remain resilient and optimistic? Because that is the challenge, isn't it? Not to despair.
Is. So, of course, the basic practice of any contemplative tradition, you know, Zen, but all of the others also, is to step outside your preconceptions into this very moment. And another word for that, using a very different vocabulary for me, is a little humility. You know, to have a little humility in the face of, because despair is, after all, thinking you know what's going to happen and it will be bad. And if you recall your humility, we never know what is going to happen. We can't predict it. We're not omniscient beings. There are also, some basic practices beyond the practice of meditation itself. Some people take up the practice of gratitude, of writing at the end of every day, 3 things to be grateful for in a notebook. And, the scientists have shown that people who do that actually do become more resilient and more hopeful and optimistic and just cheerful. A practice that I kind of invented for myself. I had gone for the first time to read in Australia, and I was introduced to what people say there as a kind of general exclamation of happiness, which is, you beauty, you beauty. And I loved that phrase. And I took up the practice of every morning when I open my eyes and see the first thing I see, which when I'm home is either Mount Tamalpais or fog keeping me from seeing Mount Tamalpais. But whatever I see, I open my eyes and I try to bring forth as my first greeting on the day, you beauty. It's very helpful.
It's interesting. When I was a student at Berkeley, I used to look out the window and see Mount Tamalpais across the bay. So I get it. Many of the poems in the collection are odes or elegies, testaments to grief and loss. So just as far as you're concerned, how can poetry offer a path through grief? A lot of people practice poetry who will never publish. It's not really their concern. How is it for you?
Well, I would have been writing these poems even if I were writing them on sand on a desert island and the ocean was erasing them every night. Because for me, they are the way to enter my life with greater largeness, unpredictability, and the aim, the intention of both seeing things for what they are and being totally permeable to my life as it is, which is very much the intentions with which I began doing Zazen 50 years ago, but also to find a way for my life to feel malleable, workable, that it is not iron frozen into a shape, it is clay. And one of the things that comes with the practice of writing is you actually can revise a line. You can look at something you've written and you can, later, not as you're writing it, because we all have to allow the first draft to emerge without a judging mind squeezing it into silence. But when you look at what you've done, you can look at the line and say, oh, that isn't seeing clearly at all, or that's a bit self-centered, or I was really angry. I wonder what's under that. And by revising a poem, you can actually revise your fundamental relationship to your own life. There's a little quatrain by Yeats that I love to that effect, where he said, my friends who say I do it wrong, whenever I revise my song, do not know what is at stake. It is myself that I remake. Isn't that marvelous?
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I've often heard you, I listened to a lot of your interviews. I, of course, read your poetry, and you often talk of acceptance of everything, saying yes to uncertainty, discomfort, the unknown. I'm wondering, are acceptance and resilience the same thing or very closely related things? Or how do you see that? Because I found that kind of acceptance can lead to resilience. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. I think, they are not the same thing, but one is probably the precursor to the other. Because if you are fighting off the realities of your inner and outer worlds, how can you possibly have any energy left, any psyche left, any spirit left, any emptiness left to allow the gleam of beauty, the gleam of hope, the gleam of humility in? And so the saying yes is a prior practice, I think, It would be if you were saying no to the difficult parts of our lives, how could you be resilient before them? Because half of your experience would be cut off from availability. It would be like trying to run without having both legs there to help. It's possible, but it's very difficult.
Okay, so I'm going to move on from optimism. I could talk about that poem for another 45 minutes, I guess, or all day, but you've worked in partnership with artists, musicians, but also scientists. And your interest in science comes through in your poetry, including the one that I just read. How do you see scientific inquiry and curiosity in terms of your Zen practice and your general poetic practice of asking? After all, the book is called The Ask.
Well, I think these two endeavors they begin and carry on in much the same way for a long, long time before they start taking distinctive forks in the path. Zen practice for me, maybe there were two gates by which I entered it. One was the gate of suffering, and as many people do, they are looking for a way to work with, reply to, live inside some difficulty, this being a human being, it's hard. But the other thing which drew me into the practice of Zen as a monk for 3 years and residential practitioner within San Francisco Zen Center's 3 places for 8 years was a true desire to see things as they are. And that, of course, is also exactly the endeavor of science. And the spirit of, you used the word curiosity, and I think curiosity is one of the great unlockers of almost anything worth finding in this world. If you think you know things, you will only see what you know. If you want to know more about something, you want to learn, then the narrowing of vision of 1 + 1 is 2. Well, then some mathematician says, well, what is a number anyhow? And some mathematician, 1,000 years ago says, could there be a zero? Concept of zero turned out to be pretty useful. And so one of the questions I ask each of my poems as part of the process of, before I consider it finished, I ask the poem a lot of questions. I ask it if it's comprehensible to someone who isn't me. I ask it if its grammar is right. I ask it if it would be better in a different verb tense or grammatical voice. It's an I poem. What would happen to it if it was a third person poem? I also ask it, is there something I haven't said yet that wants to come in? Or is there something I've said too much of that wants to leave? And maybe let the reader draw a conclusion for themselves, rather than, nobody likes to be lectured at. Nobody likes to be told everything. We really love to figure things out. That is, I think, just deep in the human psyche, is the joy of putting 2 and 2 together for yourself. And most of my poems are asking their readers to complete the poem within themselves after they've finished reading it. They're the ones who complete the equation or the chemical reaction or bake the bread dough, whatever metaphor one wants to use. But this fundamental spirit of inquiry, it just feels better to me than any other way of going through the world. Who are you? What else? What have I missed? Is there another way to see this? Is there a beautiful music I'm not hearing because my ears are turned not in its direction? Is there more compassion I can find? I mean, one of the earliest poems that I wrote that was explicitly about the crisis of the biosphere, 2004, I wrote a poem called Global Warming. And the reason that I wrote it was because I was so perplexed by anyone who might have a grandchild or care about the future at all being a climate denier. And I couldn't understand. And so there was a part of me that was sort of stomping its foot. And I don't find myself very attractive when I'm feeling that way. You know what I'm saying? Well, how could you possibly? That's not a state of mind I enjoy being in. And when I made the connection between the story of that poem, which I might be able to recite by heart, but can I take a second and look it up? It's very short. It's only 4 lines. And I don't want to say it wrong. Okay. It's wonderful. With the selected poems, they give you an alphabetical index at the back, and you can find poems in all these pages. But I looked it up wrong, or read it wrong. Patience, sorry, everybody. Oh, maybe I finally found the first mistake in the book.
Uh-oh.
Okay, no, I didn't. I haven't found a mistake in the book yet. Global warming. When his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up, unable, it seemed, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. And when I remembered that story, I mean, it's a true story, that literally, having never seen a large ship like that, they did not react to it at all. And it was only when the small boats were launched off the side that suddenly this became visible to them. And for me to put that story with the climate deniers and to feel, okay, unable to fear what was too large to be comprehended, I found compassion rather than condemnation. And it simply felt to me a better relationship to the situation. To feel compassion rather than condemnation always feels to me something that allows me to breathe more deeply.
Yeah, you do write in response to the climate crisis as one example. Many of the poems in the collection were written in response to any number of crises, the Velvet Revolution, 9/11, and most recently the pandemic. How do you view the role of poetry in response to global crises like these? You do it so wonderfully with the climate, and yet you also approach other events that immediately change our perspective and our way of life, like the pandemic, so utterly overwhelmed us.
Yeah. For me, a poem is needed to respond to a question for which there is no simple answer. If there were a simple answer to any of these things, you might not need poems because you could find your way to that. Oh, I know exactly how to behave when suddenly everyone I know is afraid of dying and sequestered in their houses and we're not allowed to talk to each other. There's no answer to that. It only can be lived through and out. And so one of the shifts, I think, which has happened in my poems over the 50 years of what's in this book, I always wrote to some degree about what one might call the shared fate crises. So very, very early, there's a poem not in this book that was written after I'd read a newspaper story about women in Poland standing in line for food rations because people were starving in Poland. And somehow I was so distressed by this news that I just wrote a poem called The Women of Poland. And that has happened all my life. But what has happened much more increasingly over the last certainly half of my life, and especially the last 5-10 years of it, is that the crises have become so much larger and more foreground for me. And so many more of my poems are trying to feel my own way into and through them and to find a relationship that does bring some resilience. That is the goal, a larger view a greater understanding, more permeability, and more vulnerability to what cannot be escaped anyhow. You know, it's like some people during the pandemic, I understand, found some, not so helpful distractions. But I wanted to understand, what is it when the whole world is facing a new crisis together? And for a moment, it looked like it might bring some transformative news. I mean, do you remember the air quality got better at the very beginning because all of the internal combustion engines of the world went so much more quiet? It proved something. Unfortunately, it didn't prove enough that we didn't revert to our old ways. But it did prove how all of us globally can in fact change if we feel the need to pressingly enough. And maybe one of the jobs of the poems that I write, the ones that are expressions of grief rather than of resilience, is to keep reminding that it is possible to feel that grief wholeheartedly, to feel our fears wholeheartedly, and still live. And I think, in a funny, almost technical way of describing it, one reason that people do turn to poetry in times of crisis is because their grief also includes embrace and also includes beauty. Because good poems, their language, their music, their contents do include something beautiful, or we wouldn't react to the poem. We wouldn't read the poem. I don't read poems that only shout. They don't draw me in. There's no gate into them. But a poem of grief, whose words are beautiful, whose music moves me. And like many people, I, often if I am choosing a piece of music, I will choose music in the minor key. I find it lovely and I find it true to our lives.
I have to say that you address these crises that have so many causes and conditions that give rise to them. I just want to thank you for the clarity and the complexity with which you write about these things. It really does do them justice, and it really does capture the very confused sort of mix of emotions that we feel around them. So that has been very, very helpful to me. But I don't want to cheat our readers, our listeners, our viewers. And so I'd like to ask you to read a few poems, and Moss's would be great since we did talk about your interest in science too, but any of the ones you prefer to read.
Okay, so I will start with, as you suggest, with Moss's. And this is a poem, came from, so it's a poem that comes to be speaking about our relationship with, the biosphere and how little we actually know so far about its intricate workings, how much we must respect the mystery of that. But it began, I read a piece in the New York Times Science Times section. And as soon as I read it, I knew I was going to write about it because what it was describing was so gorgeous and so absolutely irresistible. But then, of course, it's not a poem until you find the second level, until you find what complicated emotions does that image draw from you? Why do you want to turn it into a poem? It's because you can do some thinking with it that you couldn't have otherwise done. So here's an epigraph from the New York Times, July 29th, 2020. So that first summer of the pandemic was when this appeared. And what the Times article says is, in the Mojave Desert, a translucent crystal offers bryophytes much needed respite from the heat of the sun. So it's talking about them having discovered mosses in the most moss inhospitable, place you could imagine. For hypolithic mosses, it seems, 4% of daylight is right. They live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. I think of these mosses and consider, perhaps we too are mosses, evolving to the part of our self-made Mojaves, unable to bear the full brightness, the full seeing, to recognize fully the Amazon burning, the Arctic burning, the monarch's smoke-colored missing migration. An experiment not meant to last. And yet we found shelter within it. We pondered our lives and the lives of others, thirsted, slept, to the implausible green of existence, for better, for worse, we offered our 4% portion of praises. For better, for worse, our 4% portion of comprehension. So, here's a poem written a decade and a half after global warming, but it's kind of doing the same work, which is finding its way to compassion for all of us, including me, who are very much part of the problem. I'm about to fly to Anchorage to give a poetry reading. I am in every way part of the problem. So here we are with our 4% portion of comprehension, doing the best we can, but at least recognizing that maybe I have to do some other remediation to make up for that airplane trip. Do you want one more, two more? What do we have time for?
I love this song. I'm sure.
Which one? What?
Two more. That's
more.
Great.
Okay. So these are all from the newer section of the book, except for optimism, which was earlier, and global warming, which was earlier. So this is very different tone in this poem, in which I am just looking at us, our human pluses and minuses of the title of the last book before this was Ledger, where one is always taking stock, even though the perfect way is not difficult. One must only give up picking and choosing, great Zen teaching, and yet we're always taking stock. To be a person. To be a person is an untenable proposition, odd of proportion, upright, unbalanced of body, feeling, and mind. Two predators' eyes look forward, yet seem always to be trying to look back. Unhooved, untaloned fingers seem to grasp mostly grief and pain, to create too often mostly grief and pain. Some take in witness suffering pleasure. Some make of witness suffering beauty. On the other side, a creature capable of blushing, who chooses to spin until dizzy, likes what is shiny, demands to stay awake even when sleepy, learns what is basic, what acid, what are stomata, nuclei, jokes, which birds are flightless, learns to play four-handed piano, to play, when it is needed, one-handed piano, hums, feeds strays, says, all together now on 3. To be a person may be possible then after all, or the question may be considered still at least open, an unused drawer, a pair of waiting work boots.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more.
And the last of these 3 poems in the micro reading part of this is a poem called Manifest. And it means that in both senses of the word, both in terms of what is manifest as what is visible, what comes into being, and also the list of the cargo in a hold of a ship. Hawks, rivers, cities, ochre, us. A species whose right hand sketches its left hand, but can't draw itself. Whales, geosynchronous satellites, a truck hauling folded tarps under a tarp. Wars, hunger, jail cells, praises, pratfalls, puns, gold circuits on phone card connectors. All cargo, manifest, circling the sun together each 365 days plus a few remnant hours. A story here ribboned with lightning, there dimmed by clouds, on a nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and dust-cushioned bundle, whose glaciers depart, insects quiet, seas rise. To that which is coming, I say, here, take what is yours. But forget, if you can, what is coming, find not worth pocketing, let fall unnoticed as weed seed one small handful of moments and gestures. Moments, mouse-colored, minor, gestures disturbing no one, slipped between the ones that were counted, the ones in which everything happened. A petroglyph's single fingerprint, a spider awake in an undusted corner. Let stay, if you can, what is coming, one or two musical notes hummed in a half hour that couldn't be herded or mined, made to save daylight or spend it. Leave one unfraudulent hope, one affection like curtains blown open in wind, whose minutes, seconds, fragrance, choices won't sadden the heart to recall.
That was lovely, Jane.
Thank you.
So I think we can take some questions from our audience who have patiently waited for this moment. Kathy R. asks, Jane, how did you select the poems in this collection? Was there a theme?
There was an arc, but not a theme. And I suppose it's the arc of my life, because basically what you do when you put together a new and selected is you simply go through your books with some idea that even though my editor had told me she wanted this to be a big book, there are limits. And so each book has something like, a quarter to a third of what I wrote at that point in my life in it, except the very first book, which is represented by 3 poems because I was very young then. But I picked poems that I myself still felt a relationship to. I picked poems that I knew had been meaningful to many people, because over the years, you start hearing which ones other people bring up. And so you know which ones have struck a chord. One of the poems that Tricycle, again, first published was a little poem called Advice to Myself. And I would have thought that was kind of, a small poem, a dispensable poem. So many people have spoken about it to me that I realized, Tricycle was right. And so it's in the book. Another poem that's in the book was one that I almost never took out of the drawer. I read it, I thought it was sentimental. And then I wrote it and thought it was sentimental. And then there was a reading, the next couple of days. And I thought, I'll try the new poem. And people responded to it so strongly. And I read it again, another reading, and people responded to it so strongly. And now it's a signature poem. But I didn't know that when I wrote it. Now I don't think it's sentimental, but that's because so many people have assured me that it does something useful for them. So that, maybe a little bit when you know who you became, you tilt a little towards the story of who you became, but basically it's just the poems I've continued to care about. Yeah, I care about all the ones that aren't in the book also. Please, if you've got the earlier books, don't throw them out.
I especially love Ledger, but and this one is fantastic. Again, we're putting it in the chat if you'd like to pick up a copy. Just a quick question. Sometimes people must read your poems and tell you what they think they mean. It might be utterly different from whatever you intended or you thought at the time. Does it ever resonate with you when they do? Are you ever surprised? Like, oh yeah, that too?
I'm often surprised, and it almost always does resonate.
Mhm.
There is a technical term in rhetoric called the intentional fallacy, which means that the author does not always know what they've written. There can be many other meanings. I had a poem I wrote, which I like very much for what I intended, what I thought it was about, which was, it's a poem called Against Certainty. And I love uncertainty. And as you heard me say earlier, I'm very drawn to not being overly certain of things. But then the poet Stanley Kunitz, 2 days before he died, his practice, he was 100 years old, and his relationship to poetry was saying other people's poems aloud at that point. And his assistant, Janine Lentine, sent me an email and said, Stanley is saying your poem against certainty. Would you like me to tape it for you and send it to you? And I said, of course. And it turned out to be the last good day of his life when she did that. He died 2 days later. And when I heard him read it, I understood entirely that for him it was a poem about death. And I thought it was a much more profound poem than the one I'd written. It just brought a whole new dimension into it, hearing it on his voice at that time.
Susan Bruce Hedges asks, Jane, do your poems spring from your Buddhist intelligence, or does Buddhism direct what you are trying to say?
Oh, Buddhism never directs what I'm trying to say. For many years, I kept the fact that I was a person who practiced completely invisible to the poetry world, exactly because I did not want anyone to think I was writing didactic poems or poems from some preconceived worldview. But I was drawn to practice because that worldview made sense to me. Everywhere I encountered it, which means, sometimes I was encountering it in Wordsworth or in Heraclitus or in Horace. We all know the marvelous R.H. Blythe book, Zen in English Literature. I was always from childhood drawn. And so the fact that I have practiced, I'm sure, has completely changed my poems. I'm sure I would be a different person if I had never entered formal training so early in my life and for such an extended and intense time, and continued to practice a little more gently on my knees ever since. But I never start with a preconceived idea. So the practice is in me, and I'm always very happy when people who do practice recognize that set of understandings in my poems. But my poems have fewer explicit references to Dharma matters than that of many people I know who have never crossed their legs on a zafu.
Mm-hmm. Along those lines, Jane asks, thanks so much for all your beautiful creations. Question, do you go on Zen retreats? How do you think your meditation practice impacts your writing? Similar question.
Similar question, and in some way almost unanswerable, because the way any moment, let alone, weekend of meditation changes you is beyond words and beyond naming. And so there's not some equation I can express, which would say, this moment in Zazen in, that moment out in the poetry, even though there are a few poems which actually do allude to things that because I know the gossip behind them, can say, oh, I know exactly what experience that's pointing towards. But that's rare. In general, I just think, it's as if you could ask, how did that apple I had for lunch emerge in the sentence I said after dinner? It certainly went into it, but one can't say how.
I think that's why I never call you a Zen poet. I call you a poet who also has a Zen practice.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The only adjective I'm really happy putting in front of myself as a poet is I'm willing to say human. I'm a human poet.
Right.
I'm an earthling. On that, I prefer not to cut the world up into smaller partitions, even though every one of them is true. You know, yes, I am a Zen practitioner. Yes, I am a woman. Yes, I live in America. Yes, I speak English. Yes, I live in the 20th to 21st century. All those are true. I just don't find it very helpful. When I read other people's poems, I don't read Horace with, in the foreground, Roman poet of the first century. I read Horace for what his words hold, and they are speaking to me here in California in the 21st century.
So Mark Sumner asks, starting a poem or other writing comes easily to me. Do you have advice on finishing? And when do you know that the poem is finished, at least for the time being? Thanks.
A wonderful and perennial question. For me, the first draft isn't finished until I have made a discovery. For me, every poem leaves me changed, leaves me knowing something different than I knew when I began writing the first line. And so that is the first measure of a poem being finished, is, has it made a discovery, and does the discovery move me in a way that feels a kind of completion, what Robert Frost beautifully called the momentary stay against confusion. But then there's all kinds of other ways of finishing it. There's all kinds of, revision that might go in. Very, very rarely I will only find the discovery very late. So I had written most of that poem, Mosses. I'd written and I couldn't find an ending for it. I just couldn't find, the other prong of the spark plug, says a woman old-fashioned enough to remember spark plugs in cars. And you need the gap for the spark to ignite. And I couldn't find it. And it took me 6 months before I found those last 4 lines about the 4% portion of comprehension. And then the poem was done because the transformation was in it. Another way to answer that question is, for me, poems are done when I walk away from them for increasingly long periods of time and I stop wanting to change them. So I'll walk away for 5 minutes, for 5 hours, for 5 days, for 5 weeks. And if after 5 months I read the poem and nothing in me wants to change it anymore, then it's done.
Great. So an anonymous attendee asks, many people today are looking for healing and don't know where to look. Can poetry be a healing practice?
It has been that for me all my life, because this transformation from feeling the blows of suffering and the blows of incomprehension at witnessed suffering, they want, the word healing etymologically is connected to wholeness, not necessarily cure, but the sense of wholeness. And I think that comes when understanding grows larger, more spacious. And of course, spaciousness is another translation of what is usually in Buddhist practice referred to as emptiness. Just an immeasurable spaciousness. And for me, poems help me find my way to that, out of narrowness of view, narrowness of suffering, the petulance of the small self, the indignance of the small self. And so, yes, they can. There are many, many other paths. It is not the only path. It is the path for people who are interested in the malleability that comes when we allow words to enter us and the larger wisdom that is in them to hold its own way. And the larger wisdom that is within us, but we might not be able to access when we're not allowing the words to come up from the deep aquifer of what we know but don't know we know. So every poem for me is a kind of, to use a slightly non-Buddhist vocabulary, a kind of saving grace. Because as with dreaming, they give us access to parts of the self that aren't only there when we are being willful and intentional. You have to become a bit permeable and vulnerable to write a poem. And that in itself is healing. That is already healing. Even to try to write a poem and fail is, I think, to let go your certainty about what you think you know. The failed poems, by which I mean the one that, I have to give up on, no one else will ever see, and I will never look at again. They are also part of the path, just as a period of meditation in which all you do is think restlessly. That's part of the path too. It takes a great deal of compost to make any tomato.
Thank you. Jean Malgrim writes, Jane is a fellow meditator and writer. I'd love to hear how you structure your day in terms of time spent sitting and time spent writing. Thank you.
Oh, such an embarrassing question, because I know we're all supposed to wake up first thing in the morning and have Zazen be the first thing we do. But when I am in a stretch of my life in which I'm not doing something, like tomorrow morning when I wake up and have to race to the airport early, I will neither write a poem nor sit Zazen. I will just wake up and go to the airport first thing. But because poetry is so much part of my practice, I do a poem first thing in the morning if I can. I write first, and meditation is, it will still be there later in the day, but the poem might not be. So that is my very embarrassing confession, because I know it's not a proper Zen student's answer.
I think you talked to us about the difficulty you had sitting in the beginning and what torturous it was. I think it's something we can all relate to. Or am I incorrect? I believe it was in our podcast.
Oh, it still is. I have, once when I was at Tassajara, an orthopedic surgeon came through during the summer and he said he'd look at all of our knees for us. And when he looked at mine, he just kind of shook his head and said, you really shouldn't be doing this. Please don't, push the pain too much, because you're just not built to be in this position. And yet I love the concentration that comes from even my very modified cross-legged position. I never could do, full lotus or even a proper half lotus. I think what I do is called half lily. But that position is still more concentrating than sitting in a chair. And so I would rather sit Zazen for less time in any single sitting than sit in a chair for, an hour and a half. I'd much rather sit shorter periods, which is one reason why I sit by myself now. It's been a long time since I've been able to do a 7-day sesshin, and I'm sorry. I think if I had stayed a full-time resident, perhaps my body, would still be able to do it. But the middle way for me came as the realization when I left full-time residential practice. After about 10 years, my knees stopped hurting, and I want to be able to hike on the mountain. I want to be able to, go through the day not in continual pain. And so that's the middle way for this body and this life. I also think, as a longtime practitioner, there is not so much separation between meditation cushion and how you can move through the world when you're not on the cushion. We all know Dogen admired the cooks. The cook was the equal of the abbot in the Zen temple of a Soto tradition. And, you can be practicing all of those things on the cushion and not on the cushion. And if we aren't practicing them throughout our daily life, If practice begins and ends on the cushion, who is it helping? What is it doing? It must carry into our daily life, our lives as emotional people with relationships, our lives as engaged Buddhists, perhaps active in the world of trying to put your one molecule onto the tiller of a viable future. It's all practice. I don't feel such a great division, even though, of course, there are experiences that happen in meditation which will only happen when you are actually sitting in that way. But all the koans, the person's out sweeping the garden and the stone hits the bamboo, and that's when their great awakening happens. So it's continuous.
I wish we had more time, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. But thank you for listening and joining us, and thank you, Jane. But that's all the time we have. We wish we had more, as I said. The session is being recorded, and everyone who registered will have a link to it. Since we're in multiple time zones, I know many could not make it, so they will receive a link. Jane's new collection is The Asking. A link to the book is in the chat at the bottom of your screen. We'll wait a bit so you have time to click through or copy it. And many thanks, especially to you, Jane. I know you're busy. I know how busy this book has kept you. And it's always a great pleasure and deep gratitude to you for your work.
Well, my thanks to you, James, for your marvelous questions, conducting this conversation like a maestro, and also to everybody who came and is a supporter of Tricycle, because that journal has existed for so long and supported so many, and it is thanks to those who have been part of it, whether for 2 weeks or for 20 years. How old is Tricycle now?
I think we're 32 or 33.
32. Now. I remember talking to Helen Torkov when she was thinking of starting it. So we've all been on this path together for a while now, and this is the work of Sangha and the love of Sangha and the joy of Sangha. So thank you all for being here, even though I couldn't see your faces. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everybody for coming.